Hello, National Readers. Welcome to this evening's live stream. Tonight I am joined by Alison Phipps, and we are going to be discussing the Tories' latest immigration and asylum plans. So, Alison, would you please be able to introduce yourself to our readers and give us a bit of background on your expertise on this subject?
Thanks very much, Laura, and it's lovely to be with everyone. I'm the UNESCO Chair for Refugee Integration through Languages and the Arts at the University of Glasgow. So I've worked in the field of refugee studies for about 20 years now. I also am the convener of the New Scots Refugee Integration Core Group, which is a partnership of COSLA, so the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, the Scottish Refugee Council and the Scottish Government. So that's where I sit with regard to this new bill that the Home Secretary has just introduced to Parliament.
Yes, so we've been watching a little bit of that in the newsroom this afternoon, and it seemed like the first thing everybody was saying was it feels like there have been so many different measures and bills and amendments brought forward by the Conservatives in an attempt to what they're saying, stop the boats. So I wonder if you could bring us up to speed on what's been going on sort of since the failed Rwanda plan and what's happening today specifically as well.
Absolutely, Laura. So you're absolutely right. There have been many pieces of legislation. And underneath those pieces of legislation, there have been also many administrative amendments which don't come to law and are often not announced. Immigration lawyers, solicitors will find out about these through their own mechanisms and then alert the public to them. The big piece of legislation that received royal assent last year in the summer was the Nationality and Borders Act. And that's the one that's connected with Rwanda and the so-called Rwanda plan. And as you may recall, it was the Rwanda plan that was stopped by the European Court of Human Rights and by a number of indefatigable immigration lawyers who really took every individual case of every person who was threatened with deportation to Rwanda to see if this was lawful on the part of the UK government. And in every single case, it was found to be unlawful, that sufficient time had not been given to enable due process under the rule of law to take place. So big shout out to those immigration lawyers who did that work. They are very much the unsung heroes of the immigration movement. And we've some great immigration lawyers in Scotland. And they are often working for an absolute pittance to do this human rights work and to protect people's right to migrate. So the Nationality and Borders Act is in place, and much of what we've seen and what I think we're seeing as I'm beginning to read through the pages of this new bill is already covered by the Nationality and Borders Act, but also by a set of powers from 2021 as well, a set of discretionary powers introduced then. And you really have to ask yourself the question, how is it possible that a government or a regime that has been in power and with the majority that it has had for 13 years has not been able to sort out this mess? It's maybe worth readers, if they're interested in this, having a look at the immigration barrister Colin Yeo's book called Welcome to Britain. And he excavates the troubled history of at least the last 20 years of immigration bills, all of which tweak and tinker, try and make an ever more hostile environment, ever more hostile, and every single one of which is a failed piece of legislation. They're all in many ways a bit like the Dangerous Dogs Act, that is often cited as a piece of legislation that was brought about to fix a problem that didn't need fixing, that shouldn't have been brought to Parliament in this way, that largely wasted parliamentary time, was covered by other pieces of legislation, and really needed to be repealed and something new brought in. And I think with what we're seeing today, we've got a similar situation, that it may well be that this bill passes into becoming a new Immigration Act, but that doesn't make it a good law. And many of the provisions in this are extremely troubling overall.
So could you give us an idea of what some of those provisions are, Alison? A lot of what I've heard discussed today has been about the idea of human rights. Will this be compatible with the existing human rights law?
Yeah, so I'm going to just read you from the very first page of the bill, which was published about 30 minutes ago. So I haven't read it all, and I know there are many lawyers and colleagues of mine reading this in detail and tweeting in horror at some of the drafting. But what it begins by saying is there's a heading which says the European Convention on Human Rights, which we are a founding signatory to, you remember, and which has nothing to do with the European Union and our membership of the European Union. It's a separate entity. So the European Convention on Human Rights, Secretary Suella Braverman has made the following statement under Section 19(1)(b) of the Human Rights Act 1998. And she says, I am unable to make a statement that, in my view, the provision of what she's calling the illegal migration bill are compatible with the convention rights. But the government nevertheless wishes the House to proceed with the bill. So in other words, in non-legal bill speak for national readers, this bill is not compatible with human rights as laid out in the Convention on Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights. But nonetheless, this government wishes to pass a bill for the first time that is not compatible with convention rights. That means that this bill will take us out of the convention. The Nationality and Borders Act already took us a long way out of the Refugee Convention, and UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, made a very unusual statement and a very clear statement of UNHCR's absolute opposition to the Nationality and Borders Act last year, to the Rwanda plan as incompatible. And I'm expecting in the next couple of days that we will get a statement from both the UNHCR in the UK, from the High Commissioner, from the Ambassador in the UK, and also potentially from the High Commissioner. So it's basically saying the UK no longer respects the United Nations as an instrument of human rights. And this is a really dangerous situation to be in. And that the first group it is going to test this out on legally are those who seek asylum in this country and who enter this country by boat. Now, this has already been undertaken in Australia with their no boats policy, which was brought in under the Abbott government. It lasted for about 13 years and it failed catastrophically. It is no longer possible for it to be in place legally. One of the things that the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, said was that the activist, author, and former detainee on Manus Island, Behrouz Boochani, who wrote what I think is perhaps the most important human rights book of the 21st century to date, a book called No Friend But the Mountains. Behrouz Boochani and Tony Abbott said, will never set foot on Australian soil. Well, he's just returned to New Zealand, where he now lives, from a book tour and a movie tour in Australia. It failed catastrophically. Manus Island is no longer a site of detention. The detainees have all had to be placed in alternative care as a result of the failure of the no boats policy. So I think we will see a similar failure. I think we will potentially see international solidarity action with those of us who care about human rights and want to uphold them for all people. There are some worrying things that I've seen, and one of the barristers who I follow has just tweeted that it looks as though anybody in this country who entered this country under provisions which will be from today deemed illegal, their children can never be UK citizens.
Their children?
Their children can never be UK citizens. Well, if that is true, and this is a question this barrister is raising on social media at the moment, but if that is the case, that means that people who enter the UK from today, but also who previously entered the UK in the back of a lorry or on a boat, who legitimately availed themselves of the legitimate and legal right to enter this country without papers or via irregular routes, as we call them, when we're being really careful with language and trying not to be inflammatory with language, those people will no longer have the right to have children who are UK citizens. What we do as a result of this, and Colin Yeo, who wrote the book Welcome to Britain, has already said this, is we create an enormous class of people who are stateless. We also, the bill is also saying that the Home Secretary can now detain anybody she believes to be in breach of the new laws that will be laid out in this bill if it passes, as long as she deems is reasonable. And reasonable is not now qualified. It used to be 28 days. So it returns us to a situation where indefinite detention continues to exist, but is also augmented in this country. It is also clear from what is in the early parts of the bill that I've read so far that the bill means that anybody who enters this country without an electronic passport is deemed to have breached the rules and is liable for deportation and has no route to asylum. Now, again, the routes to asylum are very clearly laid out in UNHCR. It is perfectly possible to claim asylum without having papers. Many people do not have papers themselves, cannot have papers because the state is not a safe state from which to apply for an international passport or travel document. Many people who fall victim to trafficking gangs or to smugglers or have their papers taken off them, sometimes taken off them to protect them, sometimes taken off them because that is how people are brought into the situation of modern slavery, where they might be indentured and required to work many years before they can have their papers returned to them. So in this statement, as I have read it, the Home Secretary is colluding with those who are smugglers, those who are traffickers, those who encourage modern slavery, by saying that she will not allow people into the country unless they have an electronic passport. So this is a really worrying provision for all of us who are concerned about people's protection within the immigration and asylum system. But I think it's really important to also say a couple of other things. And this is more my point of view, but also one that I do share with other people. I think it is clear to me that this is a piece of performance of cruelty, and this is more about the Tory government really bolstering its support with key constituents rather than it being something that can be put into action. To me, it strikes me and many others who are experts in this field as impractical, that it is incendiary, especially with the international community, where it will be inflammatory because it risks the Refugee Convention. And if a founding signatory country risks the Refugee Convention, then that potentially signals the end of the convention. And the letter to MPs that the Home Secretary has written, she really just says, I do not care that that is the case. But I also believe that this is utterly beyond the competence of this shambolic Home Office to deliver any of this. They do not have the detention estate. They do not have access to sufficient hotels in which to detain people. They do not have a fleet of cruise ships onto which to put people. There is a different industry for which hotels and cruise ships are required, which is an important industry for this country, and that is the tourism industry. They do not have sufficient people who are trained to be immigration border guards in this estate that they are thinking of. And they are in no way prepared for what they know will be many individual legal cases brought to test this bill and the provisions to be made under this potential act, should it be brought into law. So I do not believe that this will be possible for this government to enact any more than it has been possible for it to enact the Rwanda plan. And many of us now believe that the Rwanda plan has been parked until at least 2024, when, quite frankly, we'll be facing a general election. So I think what is being done here is really about dog whistle politics to a base. On Groundhog Day, because much of what is in this we've heard before many times. We're hearing the exact same mantras, and these are the ones that have been tested with focus groups that play really well with those wedge issues that were identified by Linton Crosby and Mark Textor when they first invented wedge issue politics in Australia. And the wedge issue politics that they invented and then put into place was precisely the one I've just outlined as having failed. It would stop the votes. This is the same thing yet again, but in a slightly different guise. It's a really worrying situation to be in, to see a government wanting to take away the rights of human beings, any human beings. And I think we have to, in this context, do maybe three things. And the first one, and I would say this, I'm a linguist, is we need to really take care over the language that is used here. First of all, this bill is being titled the Illegal Immigration Bill. It also has a very long title. If you have trouble sleeping, I suggest you read that title. It is actually an act of stand-up comedy in many ways. It is so ridiculous. But we should remember, and you will know this well, Laura, that Associated Press in 2013 outlawed the use of the term illegal immigrant or illegal migration. And yet here we have a government irresponsibly entitling a bill, an immigration migration bill. And I am basically saying that I really do not think that I should be somebody as somebody responsible for the education of people who uses language like that and speaks of illegal migration. There is irregular migration. There are many circumstances that lead to people making difficult journeys, which are often irregular, but which can be regularized. And we should also remember that 78% of the people currently in detention are known to have viable routes to regularizing their immigration status. So at the moment, the detention estate is largely paying vast profits into the pockets of the shareholders of the private providers, be that Serco or Mears or whoever's running the detention and hotel estates. And what we're seeing here is an appeasing of shareholders through this bill, and the use of really inflammatory language. So I think we can take care as citizens to challenge that language, to speak of irregular migration, to draw people up and go, no, you mean irregular migration, and this is why, and to really actively use that, to come up with a term for the bill that is perhaps an activist term for the bill. I'm wondering about the anti-human bill, because that is in essence what it is, but one which is really clear that that no human is illegal. But also when we talk about this bill as, quotes, inhumane, and there is much that is done within the activist space that does that, we should also be careful. My colleague at the University of Glasgow, Dr. Hiab Johannes, has really carefully written of this and says, whenever you talk about humanizing the narrative, you're suggesting that the people in the narrative are not human or are only partially human and need humanizing. So again, I think we need to be really careful with how we speak about it. No human is illegal is a really good slogan for a very good reason. And it came out of Germany. Kein Mensch ist illegal. No human is illegal. And it came out of Germany because that is the basis of their constitution written after the Holocaust, where the first line of that constitution says, and I'll say it in German, Die Würde des Menschen ist unantastbar. The dignity of the human being is untouchable. So no human is illegal, no, untouchable by the law. So that is one of the things where I think we in Scotland have done very well. I think our First Minister, but actually, and I would say this to the credit of nearly all the politicians in Scotland, they have not gone down the road of using inflammatory immigration language. And if they do, we should haul them up on it. We should train new politicians in the use of appropriate language, as the Associated Press do with journalists. And we should make sure that this discourse doesn't enter our public domain. I think we should continue. We are not affected by the protest bill in England and Wales. So keep protesting for the rights of all people, but particularly those who are in precarious situations and undocumented, or who risk being undocumented by this new immigration bill of the 7th of March 2023. And I think we also are able to continue to write to our MPs, to avail ourselves of those routes to ensuring that this is well understood. But as citizens as well, and national readers are very good at this, just keep examining the plans in detail, cost them out. I mean, I've seen figures of 1.25 billion to put into detention and keep in detention indefinitely, because this is now a provision in the bill as written, the number of people this might be affected by. Scottish Refugee Council, UNHCR UK and UNHCR have some good information and numbers, although some of what UNHCR has been putting out recently, around 100,000 people displaced, is now being weaponized by the Home Secretary and used to say that basically 100 million people will enter the UK and we can't take everyone. No one is suggesting that at all. Part of the international work, the careful diplomatic work in this area that I am part of and colleagues are part of, is about saying, how can we best support you in countries neighboring crisis areas, in the countries neighboring Ukraine? How can we support you in Poland and Moldova and Romania? How can we support you in Germany, where you've taken 1 million Ukrainians and you took 1 million Syrians? How can we do our bit to help you there, and in Jordan and in Pakistan and Uganda and Ethiopia and Turkey, where the majority of the world's refugees are housed by a very long way, also in Bangladesh with the Rohingya? What is the part we can play? We can indeed introduce safe and legal routes for people without documentation to be able to go to embassies in countries and say, I have a connection to the United Kingdom through the Commonwealth, through history, through language, through family, through your own statements, particularly for Afghans who served with the British Army, but also other groups. So I would like to come to your country. Please issue me with a travel document. That is all that is required, not a visa, not biometrics, just a travel document to be able to avail myself of humanitarian protection, right to claim asylum. So I think these are things that we can use and challenge people with in order to keep alive the roots that people like my grandparents fought for in the war, and through the trade union movements and through the human rights movements, where they really wanted the legacy of that terrible time that led to the institution of our rights to mean that these would be in place, that we would continue to have freedom of expression, and that we would have in many ways the hope perhaps of a new right, which was the right not to be lied to, and particularly not to be lied to by our Home Secretary. I have watched her statement that was released about the new bill, and it is riddled with inaccuracies. We have a right not to be lied to. We have a right to understand and be educated, and we have a right not to be pawns in a game of performative cruelty, such as is being played with the lives of stateless people or people who are seeking asylum to this country.
There's so many interesting points there, Alison, and I have so many questions that I would love to ask, but we'll try and keep it to half an hour, I think.
Absolutely.
The first thing that I want to look back to is we discussed the European Convention, and I think people are really interested to know, what would leaving the convention, what impact would that have on their human rights? What does that mean for them? That's something that I'm constantly hearing about at the moment. And the other thing is, we had a comment left by somebody, and this is something that we hear quite a lot as well, which is the idea that why are people passing through Europe to reach the UK? Why are they not just staying in Europe? So yeah, I've thrown quite a lot at you there, but
I mean, these are great questions, and they're really important questions, and thank you to those who've raised them. So the first one on human rights, in many ways we don't yet know, But we can look at the group of people where this has been tested for the last, I would say, 15 years. And that is those people who have been seeking asylum. We can look at how those people have been treated by the state. And we can see that if we ever need to avail ourselves of our human rights, our right to freedom of speech, our right to be treated well as people with disabilities, our right to be treated well as women. It's International Women's Day tomorrow. We celebrate that right. Our right to organise under the protection of trade unions, our right to education, our right to housing, our right to health, our cultural rights, all of those rights. If we are ever in a situation where we need to say, I want my children to be educated, coming out of the European Convention on Human Rights means that those rights are no longer secure and could be removed from us by a government. That is what it means. What we do to this group of people is very much what is intended for a much wider group of the population when we have a situation where we have power that is not held to account and where laws are passed that mean that the Home Secretary can act on her own authority and without the checks and balances that the law and the judiciary would offer. So it's a bleak situation, and it's one that I ask myself a lot. You know, I speak in public, I'm an academic with a right to academic freedoms, but I also know that those are being encroached upon already, particularly around issues such as the rights of the Palestinian people and the rights of academics to have a concern for or even work with the Palestinian people in that regard. So there are areas where we're seeing this encroaching and where we're having to check ourselves, and it kind of leads to a kind of cold hand of censorship on some of the work we do. And I notice it in my own work as well. So I think that that's the first notice where you go, oh, what would that do for me? That's already having an impact. The fact that you're asking that question means that your rights are being to live without in freedom from fear. They're being encroached upon already by the presence of this bill today and its predecessors, and by the hostile environment. A hostile environment for one becomes a hostile environment for other. The kind of the destitution that asylum seekers have been put through for many years on what's called no recourse to public funds, that's very much part of what the DWP have used in sanctioning people. They tried it with a group of people who were immigrants, and then they tried it on another group of people who were welfare claimants. That's the reality, and it's already happening in this country. And then the other one, it's such a good question. You know, safe countries, and why don't people just stop in Italy and Greece when they get off the boats? When we were part of the EU, there was a convention called the Dublin Convention, Dublin 1, Dublin 2, and then Dublin 3. And they said that we should help one another, that it's not fair that it is just chance that one country borders with a country that, through no fault of that bordering country, ends up with conflict and means that many people need to seek asylum. So we need to do our bit. We just need to do our bit. And that's what it means to be a member of an international community. It means we do our bit. Germany did its bit by taking 1 million during the Syrian conflict. We took about, I may be wrong on this, but about 25,000. And we had to campaign really hard for the first 5,000 and the 20,000 after. That is by no means 100 million. And there is no idea that we should take more. And it was welcomed by the international community, the part that we were playing, particularly because, and I think wisely, and this was under the Cameron government, and I don't say much that's good about that, but after we'd got them to this point, they said, actually, we should look at UNHCR's criteria on particularly vulnerable people. We have a medical system that could support this number of people. This is how we should do our bit. We should bring people who we can actually provide proper support for. So there was a quite a high degree of disability and vulnerability in the populations that we brought through from Syria. And we're now seeing those people, you know, coming up for 10 years on, really starting to be able to live a full life with dignity in this country. But that takes a long time. So it's about asking what's the best thing what's ours to do in this situation. Now, I hope that the UK government, though I don't have a great deal of hope or faith in this particular government, that they will say, we therefore need to open safe corridors and humanitarian visas and protection visas without the need for biometrics for a large range of groups. We need to take more than 22 Afghans, regardless of whether they've got as far as France and want to come across, or whether they are in Pakistan and want to come across. Because these are groups we've identified have strong family connections in the UK. When we take groups of people who have strong connections in the UK, the path to integration for everybody is much easier. The integrating communities are strong. People know how to do the work of living in this country, and there's a strong framework in which that can happen. And under international law, there is no obligation on anybody to claim asylum in the first country they come to. That's because it might not be safe, it might not be appropriate, it might not be viable, or it might be completely overwhelmed. And therefore, many people within the Dublin III Convention in Europe do claim asylum in other countries. It might be Sweden, it might be Spain, it might be France, it might be Germany, but not in Italy, Greece, and Spain, where the majority of people land. And that is part of what, and I think it's a problematic term, but what has often been called burden sharing. Now, the reason we have so many people on small boats is because those people are now unable to avail themselves of rights under the Dublin Convention. And the UK is unable to work with the Dublin Convention because, rather like the Northern Ireland Protocol, it didn't do a good job of the negotiation of the Brexit deal. It wasn't oven ready. It wasn't close to being oven ready. And the reason why we have so many people on small boats crossing the channel is because we didn't sit down and do the hard, careful, organized, respectful, diplomatic work, even through arbitration, that is needed to come up with an agreement, particularly with the French, but also with others who border the channel, to say, how can we make sure that no one dies? Now, the UK government is still posturing. It's still not doing that work. All it's doing is throwing lots of money, lots and lots and lots of money at the French government to build higher fences that don't work, that don't stop boats, that don't stop people desperate to see their family trying to cross. And believe me, I know how hard that is, having waited 15 years for family reunion to occur within my own family. I live every possibility and every nuance of this, and I know how desperate people can be, particularly if they have parents in this country who might not have long to live. They will get on a boat to hold the hand of a mother or a father again. They will come over if they possibly can, so that they can avail themselves of their rights to family reunion and be part of a family that is whole and loving, but also be part of a country that has long had a tradition of saying that it is proud to welcome people when they claim asylum. So yeah, we are under no obligation at all to say that people must claim asylum in the first country they come to. And that's for really good practical reasons that are about sustaining the international community and about meaning that, you know, that people with impunity, like Putin, or the Abiy government, or others, Erdogan in Turkey at times, don't say, we are going to unleash thousands of refugees upon you, that there isn't a weaponizing of the rights to claim asylum upon other countries by people in this way. We have to act together as an international community that respects human rights, or we all lose our human rights.
That's such an important message. Thank you so much, Alison. That was really, really enlightening. And there's been lots of engagement in the comments. I think people have really been very grateful to hear your words on this topic. So thank you so much again for joining us. And yeah, there's nobody else that we like to hear from whenever these topics are in the news. You really do explain it to people in a way that's very easy to understand and is very accessible. These are big topics that people have lots of questions about, and I do feel like we answered quite a lot of them there. So thank you so much again.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks, guys. All right. Bye.